Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian, and in this video what I want to do is talk about a problem that I see. I see atheists do this, I see Christians do this, I see pretty much everyone doing this, and I would caution you against it. Maybe it's not used in the way that I'm going to argue in this video, but what I'm going to argue in this video is that consensus is not an epistemology. In other words, we don't vote on truth. We don't come to truth just because everyone else votes on it. And I'll try to give you reasons why I think you should be skeptical when people appeal to consensus as a way for coming to truth. Then what I'm going to try to do is salvage the consensus of experts a little bit. It'll be a much weaker conclusion on why you may want to trust scholarly consensus, but realizing that just because people agree on something doesn't necessarily mean they're all right. So let's go ahead and get started. Consensus is not epistemology is what I'm going to be claiming, and the short version of this is that we don't vote on truth. And I think part of this comes from the fact that living in or growing up in a democracy, especially those of us in the United States, causes to believe that voting is somehow a good thing. And I don't think voting is a bad thing. I mean, I'm a Democrat in the sense that I believe that voting in general is good, but I want you to remember that voting only tells us what the voters report. Anything more, such as about truth, it's an epistemic and or ontological claim that's going to require some additional justification. That means if you're claiming that people can vote on truth, you need to be claiming that somehow on average people's cognitive faculties are truth tracking to be reliable enough that they can vote on the truth that it is. And if that's not the case, then we need to have some other way of coming to know truth that's outside of just whether or not people agree or generally agree on these sorts of things. So the other thing to remember, we don't vote on truth in any other particular circumstance. As a result, I do not care, and perhaps neither should you if you're watching this, if many or even most people disagree with a specific stance. What matters are their reasons for agreeing or disagreeing. Now, that doesn't mean it's not useful information to know whether a viewpoint is a left field position, is considered, debunked, or is considered to be a fringe theory, but that in and of itself does not make it false. So that's what I'm going to be trying to argue coming up. So here are a few reasons why I think you should be skeptical about consensus as an epistemology. First is that consensus changes, and people in general change their minds. If consensus is an epistemology, then truth is relative because consensus changes. And I see this happening all the time. For instance, people will say, oh, we should trust what public opinion says, even though public opinion changes. Oh, we should trust what scientists say now, even though they have different things that they agree on because of what scientists have said something different, 50 or 100 years ago. That doesn't mean that they're wrong now. That just means that we don't necessarily come to the truth of things because people voted on it. We do the best we can and people look at the reasons, but the fact that people necessarily agree on something doesn't necessarily give you a reason to believe that that is true outside of other assumptions that we're going to talk about. Next thing is that most people are simply not well informed about most topics. Even scholars can be misled by external pressures in their own field. And keep in mind, experts in a certain field may be only experts in their specific field of expertise and not necessarily outside of their expertise. And the example I give here is scientists are often very good experts in their field of science, but often poor philosophers or poor about metaphysics. And that's where people like Roos, Einstein, Marcel Truzzi, these are people that will often call out people like scientists for overstepping and making metaphysical claims when it's like, no, you're a scientist, you're great when it comes to science, but you're just as poorly informed about metaphysical matters unless you've actually taken the time to study it and do good work in this particular area. And even a consensus of scholarly experts in a particular field can be wrong. And this is a quote from Galileo. In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. So even if it's scholarly experts, even if you're talking about consensus of people that are in a specific field, those things can be wrong too, and they have been wrong in the past. One of the problems with trusting consensus of scholarly experts is you need to actually know what thing that they're a particular expert on. For instance, when we say, oh, a majority of scientists believe this, therefore we should trust this as a definition of, let's say, science or something else, realizing that there could be other pressures going on here that condition who is considered an expert. For instance, if you had asked scientists 70 or 80 years ago whether women and minorities could do science as well as white men, they would have likely said no. And this would have been a consensus of people in the scientific institutions and scientific authority. And if you believe that consensus is an epistemology that produces truth, then they would have been right. And the scientists now who disagree with that, perhaps there's a different consensus now, is just as right. And you have no way of arbitrating between these different claims. And this is the corner you're backed into if you believe that consensus is an epistemology. I think this is not acceptable. I think that truth is truth outside of whether or not people agree with the truth or not. So that's my own view on this. But of course, other people may disagree. But these are the problems that come up if you believe that a consensus, even a consensus of well-respected experts in their field, are this particular case. So what I'm asking you to do is just be careful and be skeptical when people appeal to consensus. What are they actually appealing to? Is this even a consensus of the thing that we care about in the first place? And is this being used to manipulate you, or is it actually making a good point? And I would argue that democracy and individualism, at least in the West, provide an undercutting defeater for trust in consensus. In other words, the fact that we are socialized into an individualistic and democratic type of place gives us a reason for our trust in consensus that we may not have if we were socialized or born into a society that was more of a monarchy or something like this. So the argument here is that our belief in the truth about consensus may not even be subject to whether or not that is true in the first place. It may be because we're socialized into it, which would of course debunk our reasons for trusting it in the first place. At least undercutting it, not necessarily rebutting it, but undercutting it. So what happens now? Am I trying to argue that we should be skeptical even when scholars agree? Well, perhaps to a certain degree, but understand that when scholars agree on something, it can be a good heuristic. This is going to be a practical reason and not a logical one. The fact that scholars agree, and the fact that scholars' agreement could be wrong, such as in the case of Galileo and in many other cases, doesn't necessarily give you a reason not to trust them either. I would argue a consensus among scholars will give us a practical reason for trusting that the people who are considered to be experts have actually thought about something and been convinced by the reasons themselves. But that's of course contingent on the fact that they all came to this agreement not for social, political, or conformity pressures, but actually on the basis of evidence and considering the alternatives and weighing the alternatives. So this is a practical reason, trusting in academic institutions. This is more of a trust thing, more of a faith-based thing than it is an actual logical type of reason. So consensus is a form of evidence under the assumption that consensus was produced through the use of reason and argumentation. In other words, using consensus as evidence is a means to an end, not an end in of itself. For instance, we often decide that, okay, let's go ahead and look at this or take this position more seriously because we think that the people who are in positions of authority or producing knowledge have all come to a similar type of conclusion, may give us more reasons for a priori trusting this, even if it's not necessarily the case that makes it more likely to be true, because it could be the case that they are all wrong. Maybe unlikely, but it's still at least possible. So what's the overall point here, right? Someone disagreeing with consensus is not necessarily a reason for a priori dismissing their views. And I see this happen all the time. People will say, well, that's not what the consensus says, so you're obviously wrong. No, that's not obviously the case. For practical reasons, of course, you can say, hey, this is a fringe theory. I don't like giving my time to fringe or conspiracy theories. But realize that you aren't investigating the reasons that they're providing. You're only using consensus as a heuristic, which is a very conservative in the sense that consensus tends to be very slow moving, and consensus changes slower than people's individual theories when they are right. But realize when you're doing this, you could be missing out on something that is true by not considering the evidence. This is a judgment call, and a judgment call that you need to make. There are plenty of times that I don't consider viewpoints because I think they're fringe or wacky, but I realize that I'm not considering them not because I'm actually doing this logical, scholarly weighing of the evidence and listening to their points, but because I simply think that I have better things to do with my time. But I could be missing out on something that's true. Perhaps the earth actually is flat. I have not given my time to investigating flat earthers. I think it's personally ridiculous. But the reason I think it's ridiculous is because I'm trusting consensus to generally be right about things, not because I've actually looked at these arguments for myself. And I recognize this. And I would say also beware of the pressure of social conformity, which is often used as a manipulation to basically enforce or patrol boundaries which are independent of the truth in question. For instance, people love using these sorts of things like consensus to try to manipulate people to become lockstep into social control rather than actually letting them speak what could be a fair objection or given evidence. So just be aware that these are things like social conformity is a thing that is a factor in why people may agree on something. And as a result, if it's not backed by good reasons or you see people dismissing these reasons, perhaps that gives you an undercutting defeater for trusting the consensus in the first place. As James Davison Hunter, sociologist, says, look, ruling out certain topics a priori is, ironically, a rather undemocratic use of power, and likewise in the context of scholarship, ruling out certain topics demonstrates an aversion to scholarship and in many cases would just be plain old anti-intellectualism. And generally what I want to say is that conformity is not necessarily a bad thing, except when it becomes authoritarian or except when it becomes circular reasoning. And we'll talk about this in a moment. So here's the example that I want to give. Take Jesus mythicism, the idea that Jesus did not exist, that he was just a myth that was created for political purposes or for something else. Virtually no serious respected scholar believes that Jesus did not exist. And this often gives many people, many Christians, a reason for distrusting Jesus mythicism. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus mythicism is false. Jesus mythicists could be true. I mean, they could be right. They could just be persecuted. There could be some giant conspiracy to keep their ideas out of the academia because people realize it's true. You could, of course, do all of these things. You could talk about which of these is more likely to be true, like where the evidence is more likely to be true. Like, is it really seem likely that there could be this giant conspiracy and that's why all these scholars don't agree? Or is it more likely that most of the scholars have looked at the evidence, most of the historical scholars, and come to a similar conclusion? That's one way of looking at it, but I think a more productive line of discussion would be asking scholars in particular why they aren't Jesus mythicists and evaluating their reasons based on the reasons themselves, not based on the fact that they agree. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is there really isn't an easy way other than doing the work and listening, and this means listening to other people who may disagree with you on things. You don't just get to dismiss points simply because it doesn't go along with consensus, because every good big scientific revolution started as a minority position and eventually became a legitimate view once people started looking at the evidence themselves. But once again, this is a very slow moving process. I'm not a Jesus mythicist because of the reasons given by other scholars on why they are not Jesus mythicists. But it's the reasons that these scholars have given, not the fact that it is a minority or a fringe sort of position. Saying that, oh, we're not Jesus mythicists because no other scholars are, it's kind of a vacuous statement. When you really start to think about it, you're like, wait a minute, well, if those guys are just saying this because other people said it, then they don't really have their own good reasons for not being it. And now we can no longer really necessarily trust consensus. So this becomes a kind of circular type of argument. Once again, remember, every academic revolution does begin as a minority position. Remember what Marcel Truzzi said. You do not necessarily owe people your time. If you think a line of inquiry is not worth your time, you're free to walk away and say, I'm not going to consider it. But don't make the argument that you've considered the alternatives when all you've done is simply said, I don't think this is worth my time. That doesn't mean you're an expert in it. That doesn't mean you've looked at the reasons and given yourselves good reasons to do it. So thanks for watching, and let me know what you think. Do you trust scholarly consensus? Like I said, I will appeal to scholarly consensus in general because most of the time I don't think it's true that there's necessarily a giant conspiracy to keep certain ideas out, but I do think there are political and social pressures for people in academia to conform to certain lines of inquiry, and this could be due to funding or politics or other things, that I think people need to be aware of if we want our trust in academia to be as strong as we would like it to be, as strong as we often say we would like it to be. But the question is, what we need to be doing is upholding these values of scholarship and teaching people to think critically about these sorts of things. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'm really curious to hear what you think and whether or not you see people appealing to consensus as an epistemology as opposed to appealing to it as more of a heuristic or as like, hey, this is generally a good reason. Which do you think is more likely that there's a conspiracy or that all of these scholars have thought about it? So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.